Welcome to Welfare Clinic. Housing is one of the biggest issues affecting the local communities right across the country. Housing Planning Act, which has been come into law on 12th of May this year. We're going to discuss about how the Housing Act is going to affect local community, residents, local authorities, housing associations, estate agents. And to discuss with me, I have a guest who is very knowledgeable in housing, have been in the field for 25 years, have academic background in housing, and it is Glyn Robbins. Glyn, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ollie.
You have been working in this field, as I've said, for 25 years, if not more. You probably have seen all from housing, local authority building housing, to private renting, to all of this. What is the difference between what you have seen over the years and what is happening now? What is Housing and Planning Act for our viewers?
Well, I think it is by far the biggest single threat that I've seen during that quarter of a century. And by threat, I mean threat to any concept we may have of non-market housing. So council housing is under threat. The role of housing associations as local community-friendly organisations rather than private commercial organisations is at threat. The future for private renters is very bleak because of all these. I mean, it is a real 360 degrees assault, an attempt to completely transform the housing landscape in this country for generations to come.
Many people probably don't even know this Housing and Planning Act, that it is a law now, as I said, from May, but they probably don't even know that this exists.
Well, this is one of the biggest problems we've faced. I'm involved in a campaign. It's a growing national campaign against the Act. But you're quite right. At the moment, this is a stealth attack. A lot of the people who are going to be most affected by the Act, and that could include, for instance, council tenancy, and their rents rise very significantly, the ending of secure tenancies for council tenants, the loss of 360,000 social rented homes between now and 2020. All of this and more is what could happen as a result of the Act, which incidentally, although it is law, has not yet been implemented. But as you say, very few people know about it. And so one of the major challenges we as campaigners have faced is to just raise awareness, which is why programs like this are really important, because at the moment it feels very much as though we're sleepwalking into a disaster.
There is a number of areas that I know that will affect, for example, pay to stay, starter homes, mandatory or fixed term tenancy. It affects housing association, estate agents, planning and compulsory purchase. So it's a quite massive area of housing that is being affected. And what we'll try to do as much as possible to go through each one so that our viewers can actually understand how it will affect them, and not only them but their children. Because if you got grown up children and you want to transfer your tenancy, you might not be able to do, or how it will affect. So if we can just touch on, you mentioned about council housing. So if, say, Mr. Jones or Mr. Mia living in a council property at the moment, how would this act affect them? So they at the moment have secure tenancy, they always have lived there, their children may have, or the partner have succession rights. How those individuals will be affected?
Well, let's take those one at a time. Succession rights will go. It's always been a bit of a grey area in housing management terms, but the Act effectively calls an end to succession right for council tenants.
So if somebody was living in a property, God forbid, they leave this world, parents passed away, and son or daughter wanted to have a succession rights, because you have, at the moment, you could get one succession right.
Yep.
You're saying they wouldn't be able to get that?
That's exactly what I'm saying. The fundamentals here are that the government does not want to see council housing as permanent housing, secure housing. They want to see it as emergency housing. David Cameron used those exact words when he was introducing the legislation. So succession rights will go. In future, this is not retrospective, but in future, again, if the government gets its way, there will be no secure tenancies, as you said. There will be time-limited tenancies for new council tenants. But the other major threat to council tenants, as well as housing association tenants, is, as you've said, pay to stay. And what that will mean for people in Tower Hamlets and in London is that if their combined household income, and that's the top 2 earners who are on the tenancy.
Regardless of the relationship?
So long as they're on the tenancy. The top 2 earners on the tenancy, well, no, the top 2 earners on the tenancy, conventionally that's going to be
so
husband and wife or joint tenant.
What happens if it's a single tenancy?
The same would apply. So the key point is an earnings threshold of £40,000. So if the household income exceeds £40,000, so in effect that could be 2 people earning £20,000 each, so not much more than.
So it could be son and daughter.
If the son or daughter are on the council, on the tenancy, as far as we're aware at the moment. There's a lot of uncertainty about this legislation as well. You know, what we've said from the start is it's not only unfair, but it's unworkable, and we're still waiting for some detail, a lot of detail in fact, from government as to how this is actually going to work in practice. And certainly someone from my point of view, my experience, I just think this is unworkable fundamentally. But anyway, the principles within the Act are that if household income from those 2 top earners who are on the tenancy goes over £40,000 inside London or over £31,000 outside of London, then the rent will be increased. It's, what's that, £31,000 outside of London. So you could be living in Romford, for instance, and I'm sure a lot of your viewers and their relatives do, with a household income of over £31,000.
So someone could live, as you said, whether it's in Romford or Essex, Hornchurch, wherever, but they could travel to city where they're working. They probably could be easily earning just above 31,000.
Yeah.
And they will be affected.
Well, I'm just thinking Romford actually, I think, would be classed as inside London, but you say South End, Colchester, any of those outlying areas beyond the London boroughs, £31,000 is the threshold. Your rent will go up by 15%, 15p in the pound. So for every pound over the threshold, whether it's 31,000 outside London or 40,000 inside, for every £1 over that threshold, your rent will go up by 15 pence per week. And there's no ceiling to that, or at least what the government has said is that rents can rise to the market or near market levels.
There's no cap.
Again, we don't have the detail, but what is in the Act is that rents can rise to the market or the near market levels, i.e., theoretically, council tenants in Tower Hamlets could be paying the same rent as private renters in Tower Hamlets, and you know how much that is. Right? So people could literally see their rent double or even triple. Now, whenever I say that, it feels like I'm scaremongering, but this is what the Act says, and that's why we're so determined. Well, it's not a reality yet, because we're fairly sure, I mean, come on to this, but we think the government is in serious trouble on this legislation. You know, it hasn't been thought through. As I say, the regulations that are required to implement it aren't there yet, and a lot of local councils, as well as being very angry and opposed to the Act, are saying we don't know how we're going to implement it. So there are a lot of uncertainties, but this is the scale of the threat, that people could see their rent double or even more than that. And obviously one of the consequences of that will be, well, I'll give you a real example. Somebody on the estate where I work, her household income is over 40,000. Her initial reaction to that when I told her about the Act was, okay, well then I'll have to stop work, or at least have to cut down my working hours, or I'll have to move. You know, I'd have to leave the area, the area that she's lived in all her life.
So they have to make a quite serious and life-changing choices.
And a lot of people, quite understandably, describe this as another exercise in social cleansing. That it's an attempt to effectively drive low and medium income people, working class people, out of the cities to the edges of the cities, so that the inner cities and places like Tower Hamlets, where we are, become kind of pleasure zones for people earning a lot of money, and the rest of us have to travel in and make the coffee and clean the offices. So that, I mean, it's already happening, but the Housing Act will just accelerate these developments, these tendencies.
And what about, you mentioned about the tenancy, obviously. So if people go fixed, secure tenancy, would they be forced to change into fixed term tenancy? Or
no, it won't be retrospective, but as you indicated in the introduction, another thing that we're very concerned about is what will happen if people transfer for whatever reason. So at this point, we don't even have firm guarantees that, taking an extreme but unusual example of a woman forced to leave her home because of domestic violence, and she leaves a council home with a council secure tenancy and moves to another council home, we're not yet certain that she would retain her secure tenancy. Likewise, we're really not sure about what would happen to people who transfer as a result of estate redevelopments, which are increasingly common. Over 100 estates in London now faced by so-called regeneration projects,
yes,
which have the effect of reducing the amount of genuinely affordable rented homes. We're not sure what would happen to council tenants in that situation. So no, it wouldn't be retrospective. If you've currently got a secure tenancy and you continue to live in your current home, then you keep that secure tenancy. But I think the other thing, and you've again indicated it, is even if you are in a position where this is not going to affect you personally right now, I think what a lot of people are saying, well, what about my kids? What about my grandchildren? Where are they going to live? So, I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine this, I think, but what we're looking at is legislation that is actually going to make the housing crisis worse.
And we obviously talked about housing, the council housing and people who's living in a council's property. We know already with the housing association, the game is slightly different. And is it about to get worse with if you happen to be housing association tenants rather than housing?
Well, it's different. It's different and the same, if I can put it that way. Pay to stay will almost certainly apply to housing association tenants.
And what
as
is
well.
pay to stay?
Pay to stay is what we were just describing.
Okay.
That's what the government called it. We called it a tenant's tax, because
Okay.
that's what it is effectively. But pay to stay is where your rent will go up
Just a portion
significantly if you go over those earning thresholds, those income thresholds. That will, as far as we're aware at the moment, apply to housing association tenants as well. Though it's critical to add to this that housing associations have more discretion, and we're putting pressure on housing associations to declare their hand, as it were, and say whether or not they are going to implement pay to stay and impose those kind of rent increases on their tenants or not. And again, we don't really know yet. So pay to stay, or the tenant tax, will apply for housing association tenants as well. A lot of housing associations already issue fixed term tenancies, so there may not be a huge change there, but there'll be more incentives for housing associations to offer shorter, less secure, less permanent tenancies. But the other important thing to add about housing associations is that, well, until yesterday anyway, it appeared that the government was very keen to extend the right to buy, which council tenants have had since 1980, to housing associations. Now, actually yesterday there was a story saying that the government, again, some more evidence that they're in trouble on this, is delaying the implementation of extending pay to right to buy. But obviously that would offer some opportunities, in theory anyway, to housing association tenants to buy their home. But then again, how much would an average 2-bedroom housing association home in Tower Hamlets cost? I know
£1 million, depending on where
exactly
it is.
Where I work in Islington, on the adjoining estate to the one where I work, a 2-bedroom flat in the Peabody estate is on the market for £750,000. Well, not many housing association tenants are going to afford that. But of course there will be loan sharks and property developers and speculators and spivs out there who will be very keen to try and take advantage of this.
But obviously on the right to buy, it's will be obviously out of that topic, but because you touched on it, although I don't blame people who buys the properties or given the opportunity, I'm sure if people had money saved up for children, their grandchildren, they want to invest something, buy a property and leave them for them. So they know that the children or the grandchildren wouldn't have to worry about it. But really and truly, it affects the wider community more. Right to buy you give, because if you look at it, and I say this with a lot of respect to our viewers, but we have people who owns 10, 15 properties, and they run as a business, and they charge huge amount of rent to people. They don't necessarily live in those properties. Sometimes they put people in there who then become antisocial and causing problem to the neighbors, doesn't really get dealt with it. But then, but more importantly, whether it's local authority or housing association, they have lesser homes to give it to somebody who's maybe desperately in need of housing.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the fundamental again here is, do you see a home as somewhere to live or somewhere to make money from? Well, obviously there is a speculative frenzy out there at the moment. You know, we can argue about how long that's likely to last and how reliant the economy has become upon that kind of property speculation. But nonetheless, you're right. In Islington, again where I work, the council was saying that the amount of housing that can be made available to the 18,000 people on the waiting list, that's almost as many as in Tower Hamlets, if the Act goes through, will reduce by half. So the number of people who can be helped, if that's the right way of putting it, or be given the home that some of them might have been waiting for years or even a decade, the number of people who will be able to have a secure home, either as council or housing association tenant, will be reduced by half as a result of these changes. And there's more salt in the wound, because to pay for some of the cost of extending right to buy to housing association tenants, what the government is saying is that councils will have to sell off their homes as they become empty. So again, instead of an empty home on the estate where I work being made available to one of those 18,000 people waiting on the waiting list, that home will be sold off and end up in the estate agent's window. So again, another home lost. We have very little information.
So if I was living in a particular property, I've decided to, or I've been offered a bigger property or a smaller property, or I've bought my own property and I live that property. In current climate, that would then go whatever the local authority, their system, bidding system, whatever, for local residents or people who registered for housing to bid. Are you saying then, because of this act, it will be potentially council or local authorities will be prevented from putting that up to be bidded by the local community or local people who's on the housing list, and it will be instructed, you have to sell this in market?
Well, the government's a little bit cleverer than that. They're not instructing. What they're saying is that they will make an assumption about how many empty homes there are in Tower Hamlets any given year. They'll make a calculation about how much those homes would be worth if they were sold, and then they'll bill Tower Hamlets Council for the equivalent amount. So effectively they'll shovel the responsibility for whether or not the homes are sold onto the council, but ultimately, the way it is looking at the moment, the council will have to give that money to the government as a levy, or by selling the homes as they become empty. The proceeds from those sales or an equivalent amount will go to the government. The government will then redistribute that money to housing associations to pay for the discounts for the right to buy for housing association tenants. I mean, you couldn't make it up, really. I think even those of us who've worked in the field for a long time and campaigned around it for a long time sometimes find it hard to believe that this could really happen. But it is going to happen unless we stop it. And
where you mentioned, obviously, through your campaign or the other colleagues who are involved in the campaign, trying to put pressure onto housing association not to implement some of those policies, i.e. pay to stay or tenant tax, as you have called it. Are the housing association likely to listen? Have any of them listened, or
Not as I'm aware of yet. I don't think we've had any, as it were, positive responses. I think there are housing associations who are concerned about various aspects of the Act as well. They're keeping their heads down on it. I mean, they're obviously very threatened about the right to buy because at the moment we have very little information.
Because a lot of the housing association quite small.
Well, if they're small or even if they're large, because obviously if homes are being sold off, and at the moment we have very little information about replacement, the government is saying that they'll build 2 new social rented homes for every one that's sold, but this is cloud cuckoo land. I mean, at best, you might be able to build 1 or 2, but it won't be in the same area. If you sell a home, a housing association or council home in Tower Hamlets, you're not going to be able, for the price of housing in inner city areas, you're not going to be able to replace them like for like. So housing associations will be worried about their business plan. And I mean, that's a key word. Housing associations have become increasingly commercialised over the years. I think we've seen a lot of them deviate significantly from the kind of principles that they were established upon. They've become, certainly the bigger ones, almost indistinguishable from private property developers. And again, the Housing Act is going to give them more incentives to behave in that way. And it's also reducing the amount of regulation. So housing associations will have more freedom to switch between social rented housing and private housing for rent or sale. Again, a lot of the big ones have already started to do this, but one of the biggest, Genesis, has actually said, we don't want to be in the social rented housing business anymore. So they're completely divorcing themselves from the thousands, indeed millions across the country of people who are in housing need. Some of the big housing associations are effectively turning their back on those people and looking at the bottom line.
And obviously your role as a campaigner is a voluntary role along with many other people that you work with. But apart from you guys, who is responsible for informing the community, the general public, the tenants, residents, what on earth is going on? Because even for me to understand and take all of that, it's quite a lot of information.
And we've only scratched the surface, there's more.
And we're just talking about the broader outline of the policy, not going into details. And I think if somebody were to really and truly, how many people actually look at the Parliamentary Act or anything, some of those policies, but they obviously rely on some kind of information because these are massive changes and it could affect for generation to come.
Well, to answer your question, I think I have to say that this is an area in which our political representatives, our local authorities and housing associations are failing us, are failing their tenants and the wider community because they are not doing the thing that you've just described. They are not informing their tenants. And I think that irrespective of the politics of this, that is a fundamental responsibility that a landlord has.
But surely for the politician this is well above their politics because it affects people's livelihood, it affects the next generations and their livelihoods.
And some politicians have responded better than others. So in Islington I often talk about it as an example of a council where they have been much more proactive. For instance,
is it because Mr. Corbyn's
constituency
falls in there?
That's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons. But no, what there's been in Islington has been a real grassroots campaign that's involved tenants from different tenures, so private and housing association and council and trade unions, and local councillors have responded to that pressure, and so in March they wrote to every council tenant in the borough, informing them.
Who wrote? Who wrote?
Islington Council.
Oh, Islington Council.
Wrote to every.
So they've taken a lead.
They have taken a lead, but what we're, I suppose, puzzled and frustrated by is that why more councils aren't doing the same. Our council, Tower Hamlets, hasn't done it, and again, I think this is just a responsibility that they have, and that it's really letting down. And in your view,
why do you think they're not doing it?
I think it's partly fear. I think because there are still some uncertainties about the Act and how it will be implemented, and so they're being cautious. But in the end, I think that's a very misguided strategy. It's a bit like sticking your head in the sand, hoping it will go away. It's not going to go away. The other thing that Islington Council did was call a public meeting. They wrote to the tenants in the borough, they told them a bit about the Act, or the bill as it was then, said come to a meeting at the town hall. 600 people came. And there's been a fantastic campaign in Islington ever since against the Act.
And
now,
has the Islington Council said they're not going to implement the Act, or what they doing that other council can follow or be encouraged by?
At this point, I think the things that I've just said, inform local people, tenants, the community as a whole needs to be engaged in this issue, and then we join forces and fight together and say to the government, we are going to resist this and oppose it. I don't see any reason why all local councils can't do that, certainly all Labour controlled
Is there a lot of
councils.
resource issue? I can't see any huge amount of resources needed to do all of that.
It's the cost of a stamp, basically. And if Islington Council can afford to do it, why can't every other council? And a lot of councillors, whatever their political shade may be, know just how damaging this legislation could be. So they need to be more proactive, more courageous, and engage with local people and tell them about the dangers that are out there. And we're waiting for other councils to follow the lead of Islington and to treat people as adults and invite them to come and hear more. And the critical point about that is, as I said earlier, we know the government are in trouble on this. We've already seen a government that is having to row back on various other policies.
I was about to say this, yeah.
Now, without getting into the big politics of all this, this is not a government that's in a strong position. And the amount of criticism that has been generated about the Act, we had a meeting, a national summit we called it, a few weeks ago in central London. 250 people came to it from all over the country. And we also had a statement at that meeting that was signed by 23 faith leaders, including bishops, the Bishop of Stepney, who initiated the statement, but also the Muslim Council of Britain and faith leaders from other churches and organisations, all criticising the Act, all calling upon the government to think again. So we could build a very powerful coalition of opposition to this Act, and we could beat it. We could defeat this. The comparison is not an exact one, but people would often remind themselves and others of the poll tax.
Would I be right in guessing that if all the local authorities were to come together and say that we're not going to implement this, or we don't agree with this part of the Act or that part of the Act, that would probably send a very massive, powerful message to central government?
Unworkable. Yes, I mean, there's no question about it. Unless local councils ultimately agree to impose or implement this legislation, then it won't happen. But at the same time, no one council can fight this individually. Hello. So we need councils to work together. It has been starting to happen. I know that there have been meetings of Labour-controlled London councils. I know there's stuff going on outside of London as well. I know that some MPs, including some Tory MPs, are also very worried about the legislation. So it's all to play for. This is not a lost cause. I
guess this policy affects, regardless of your political views or opinion, whether you're on the left or on the right or on the centre, wherever you are, it's going to affect you.
Well, we need somewhere to live, all right? And we're already in a housing crisis of historic proportions. And as I said earlier, this legislation will make it worse. Be no doubt about that. What we're seeing are the potential for fundamental changes in the kind of housing system that we've had in this country for getting on for a century. This is an attempt to turn back the clock. This government wants to take us back to the kind of conditions that my parents and grandparents had to endure just down the road from where we're sitting now. And I think we have to say we refuse to go back to those kind of conditions where slumlords had complete control, where tenants constantly faced eviction, where rents were constantly going up. I mean, a lot of younger people in London now are seeing that happening as it is.
Something we see in the privately rented accommodation at the moment.
Well, that's where we're going.
If you complain, you get evicted.
Exactly.
Or you get eviction notice to leave the property.
And there will be even fewer alternatives to private renting. And that's what the Tories want. You know, anyone who's studied housing knows this statistic. In 1918, 90% of people in this country were private renters. 90%. Now, because of the campaigning of the labour movement and trade unions and people in different places, council housing became part of the mainstream, and by the end of the 1970s, 1/3 of the people in this country were council tenants. Well, that's now reduced to about 8 or 9%, a similar amount for housing associations. This government wants to go back to a situation where, again, the private landlord rules supreme, and we can't afford that to happen.
No. On the Act, I've also seen the estate agents are affected. Now, estate agents at the moment, depending on the type of service they provide, they sell properties, rent properties out. Some of those properties that they rent out is actually the privately, or the somebody's owning 2, 3, 4 properties, which is a kind of business. They give it to estate agents to manage on their behalf. So how would estate agents be affected in all of that?
Well, you might be telling me something I don't know, but I don't claim to. The original legislation was 100 pages long, and although I've talked about this on many occasions, I'm not aware of any direct implications for estate agents. I mean,
so it could be interconnected.
Well, it will be interconnected, because you're quite right. Estate agents have an increasingly prominent role, both buying and selling homes. Obviously, that's how they make their money, but also managing them. Letting agents, you know, on any council estate, including the one where I work, an increasing number of the homes on that estate are managed privately by letting agents. I think they'll see this as more opportunities for them to make money. And again, this goes back to a fundamental question. And as a side issue, you're right. I mean, certainly I see it where I work. There are problems associated with lots of private renting in some areas. You know, you get a very transient population, people don't really get a chance to know each other. The whole concept of community begins to disintegrate a bit. Well, estate agents aren't really bothered about any of that. What they're bothered about is their fees. So I think they will see this as a good thing for them. The property industry generally will see this as a good thing, but it's a very bad thing for local communities.
We're almost coming to the end of the show. Glyn, time goes very fast when you talk about issues which is interest as this. But what would your advice be to our viewers? What steps should they take? Where should they go to seek advice? What kind of help is out there for them to understand? First of all, to understand this, and if they are in trouble, what do they do?
Well, they need to find out more. They need to bombard our council, their council, for information about the Act and how it could affect them. They need to bombard their councillors and their MPs and say to them, you are our elected representatives, what are you doing about this? Your silence on this issue is deafening. That's not good enough. This is a major threat to me, to my family, to my community. What are you doing about it? At the moment, as I say, we're in a bit of a hiatus, in the sense that the Act has not been implemented. The government has a timetable which targets April 2017 for implementation. That is looking increasingly unlikely, but that's no cause for complacency. We need people to find out more about the Act, but also, and this is essential, get involved in a campaign that is growing to oppose it. You know, this is not going away. It's now law. It will have to be repealed. Now, the Labour Party passed a resolution at its conference committing to both leading the opposition against the Housing Act and to repeal it if and when it becomes a government. So we want the Labour Party to deliver on that conference commitment, and we want to see more activity on the ground.
If we, just my final question before we finish, if we were going by the motion passed at the Labour conference, all the Labour local authorities should naturally follow that, shouldn't they?
They should. It's Labour Party policy. And the leader of the Labour Party has made it very clear that he fundamentally opposes the Housing and Planning Act. Other Labour Party members need to follow his lead.
Glyn, thank you very much for coming to the show and sharing the knowledge.
Thanks, Ollie. Thanks for having me.
I hope you found this useful. It's a very important issues that would not only affect you, but affect your children, your grandchildren. You lose your secure tenancy. You would not have a succession rights for your children, for your family members, that which you at the moment benefit from, whether it be councils or housing association tenants. I hope the show was useful. I hope you'll get the advice and support you need. You will get involved in the campaign and find out more so that you can lobby your local authorities, your council, to get things done and to support this campaign. Until next time, do take care. Thank you for watching Welfare Clinic.